So welcome in, everyone. It is Q4. It's been kind of a weird year, but a lot of our businesses have really stabilized since the initial shock of coronavirus. For a lot of us, that looked like moving to the cloud, shifting to virtual meetings, more Teams, more Slack, more Zoom. We did that in the initial flurry, and then we got back to business. And for a lot of us in Q4, we've started, really shifting to being in that heart of 2021 planning. You might be here because your organization is anticipating more growth and you need more infrastructure to support that. You might be here because you're in a highly competitive space where margins are tightening. You need processes to be better. Costs need to be more controlled, and managing order lead times can't happen on a spreadsheet anymore. As companies grow, they always have some system that they use, whether that's, in the true startup stage with spreadsheets and basic accounting like Excel and QuickBooks, or you might have a legacy ERP system that's not meeting your needs anymore as you grow. It might be ERP, it might be a complex Frankenstein system of spreadsheets and point solutions that in amalgam add up to a makeshift ERP. But really today is about, leaders of these organizations who have identified, okay, we have to start assessing what's next for our company. So, with that, how many of you, and you can raise your hand, you can drop a note in the channel, how many of you have a true ERP system yet, or just using spreadsheets and like QuickBooks or some version of that? Raise your hands, come off mute, you can just stay silent and I can guess. Okay. I guess on the other side of that, is there anybody that has like a legacy or on-prem system that you've been using for many years and really just looking to assess kind of what the next stage might look like? Looks like we've got one yes to that one. Okay, great. So I won't linger too long on this, but as we get into the day, feel free to ask questions. Put them in the channel. If it's a quiet moment, feel free to hop on the mic. We have some prepared questions and talking points, but most importantly, we really want to make sure this is a valuable hour for you. So make it so. Ask those questions as they come up. If you don't feel comfortable, feel free to just drop in the channel. But I'll move on to the intros really quick. So I'm Gavin McLaughlin. I'm a business transformation consultant with CSG Pro. CSG Pro is a business intelligence and custom application development firm. As a business transformation consultant, it's really a fancy way of saying that I help our clients realize business value from our projects, keeping a strategic eye on the technical work we do. My background's in doing balanced scorecards for the C-suite, from state health agencies to Fortune 500 pharma companies. And then I will let Andrea Jones of Andrea Jones Consulting intro herself.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm Andrea Jones, and I have AJC. We do project management, change management, and process improvement work. And I've been a project manager for more decades than I want to admit, but we really enjoy helping clients execute work and keeping them on track while they do their day jobs. Peter?
I'm Peter Adams. I'm with Aldrich Technology, and we basically help companies assess and select ERP systems or other systems in which you embed business process. We do a lot of work with cybersecurity and IT services.
Awesome. Okay, now we'll move us forward into really the question portion of this. So, how do I, as a customer, know that it's time to start considering upgrading my company's ERP?
So I'll take that one. So the first thing is, from the standpoint of the executives, nobody actually wants an ERP system. They don't want to buy anything like that. What they want is answers to questions they're asking about their business. So questions like, what happens if I raise my prices by 3%? What if I take a discount on this product from a vendor? What if the terms change on something? What if I change a process routing or bill of materials, right? What happens to my business? These are the kind of questions that people ask, and answers to those questions are typically derived from an ERP system if it's well implemented. So I go back to the premise that people don't want the ERP system. What they want is the answers to questions. And so that helps liberate people as you're looking to get an ERP system. Keep in mind the end goal you're after. What problem are you trying to solve? What kind of company do you want to be in the future? What kind of questions you're going to have in that future? What answers do you need? How do you make sure you have that data and you capture that data and automate those processes now?
Yeah, I'll just, thank you, Peter, chime in on that one more from maybe a change management or people perspective from with a story. So we are helping implement an ERP right now with a client, and they told us that their previous system, which the client is about a $40 million company, and they're a subsidiary of a $300 million company. So in the previous system, it took the accounting team 3 people to close the books in the smaller company where we're helping with the new implementation. Whereas in the larger company, it only took them 1 accounting person. So, if your people are feeling like there's got to be a better way and they're starting to get super frustrated, that's also a good indication it might be time to consider upgrading your system.
And then a follow-on question for both of you. So as people are really assessing their need, what do they do wrong in that process? Do they wait too long? Do they get too trigger happy to just select the right system? Do they get stuck in analysis paralysis? Kind of where do you see people slip?
So I see it in a couple different areas. So I'll just kind of run down some of the litany, I think, of some of the big errors that are out there. So first of all, in the backdrop is that 75% round numbers of ERP projects fail to meet the objectives. So that's a very high failure rate. And when we started looking at pulling apart the data, what drives that, there are a couple of things. So one is a lot of people tend to choose an ERP system based on a recommendation from a friend or colleague that's in a different line of business. And just because an ERP system works for somebody else doesn't mean it's going to work for you. They also buy one based off review or what's popular in public. And if you go to some of the sites that reviews, or you look at how many stars they get or whatever, what those people are actually reviewing was the quality of their implementation, not the package itself. Because you can find reviews where they love the system and reviews where the people hate it, and it's the same system. So I think what they're actually reviewing is their own implementation process. The other thing they do is they don't engage the people. They try and make a decision and enforce that decision into the organization. And if they don't get the buy-in by the people who are going to do the work, and if they're not committed to the outcome and it's not a collective outcome, then it makes implementation very difficult. So, those are kind of like the top things that we suggest and some of the big errors. So, Andrea, you want to add to that?
I would just echo all of the things you said, Peter. And of course, being a project management company, would also say, I think people slip up when they expect the project to move forward because maybe you have a timeline or something, but they don't have somebody in charge of that timeline, right? People don't just do things always without a little bit of framework. So it's always good to have someone steering that ship, I would say.
Right. So let me add on to that. So if you try and implement the ERP system yourself internally using only your internal resources, what you'll buy when you get from the vendor is they will want to do the implementation the way they know to do the implementation as a standard way that makes it easy for them to implement so they can make the most profit, get it done the quickest, and have the highest chance that their project from their point of view will be successful. That doesn't mean it's going to be optimized for you or your business. It doesn't mean they're going to do the things or make the decisions that you need made so that you get the best possible outcome. That's, to Andrea's point, that's really one of the values of having a third-party person in that process to help pull not only the vendor into the fold, but also your own company. Because if you're the employee and you're in charge of the system, are you going to ask yourself the tough questions? Are you going to try and really dig in as to, why do we do things that way just because we've always done them that way? You really need to kind of pull that out and think about it. And the last thing I'll add is you want to look at the future business you're going to become, and you want to automate and build for that business. You don't want to just try and patch the problems or fix the issues you've had with your old ERP system. So you want to make that going, you want to move that forward, and you want to take your company in a positive direction. And that usually takes an external resource to help you with that.
Awesome. And that's actually a perfect segue to my next question. What do I look for in a new system? Like after I've made that decision for it, what do I start? How do I even approach that?
So we help a lot of companies with ERP selection. And really what it comes down to, the number one thing is knowing what you want to be when you grow up. So you need to have a good understanding, a pragmatic understanding of the business you want to be, the major processes you're going to have in that business. So you know now what the solution is going to look like. Because when you're vetting ERP systems out there, there's 4,000 different ERP systems out there, you want to make sure that you're going to find one that generally fits the sector of business you're in and the way you operate and can automate the processes that you think are key to your business. And the best way to do that is to know what you want to be when you grow up.
Yeah, and Peter, you're really the expert in helping drive those questions and asking the right questions. You've seen so many things. From our side, we really drive the process and, again, the execution. And so we will be talking with you about and listing out and writing them down. What are the things you need to have to fit that future state? And what are the things you'd like to have or your nice to have list, right? And we have processes and templates that'll help go through those things. And once you've identified your needs and your nice to haves, you'll even probably prioritize a subset. And then you're doing your research and you're evaluating. We had a company that they do technical services and they really needed to be able to schedule services by the GPS of the service location and not the company's headquarters, which wasn't always where the technical service was happening. And so GPS locations routing was essential. And so, it's pretty quick to go out and find out whether the systems you're looking at will have that or not, and make a first pass evaluation. But that's just part of the process when you are selecting, is being rigorous about those things.
Yeah, and I would add, like, from our perspective, and really that data strategy piece, it's also understanding what value you expect to get from the system and being really concrete in the measures you're going to use to derive that value, so you can actually drive towards something. You know what you're going to be measuring, and you have a target on the wall now. I see that we're getting a couple questions in the chat. Amanda asked if there are any good specific questions that can be asked to draw out the information needed.
So yes, we have a process that starts with the questions you're asking about your business. And it's really, this again drives more towards the leadership team of the organization, but to understand what problems and challenges they're facing and what specific questions they're asking. Then you can look and say, okay, to answer those questions, I need to provide this kind of data or information, this frequency displayed in this fashion to these people. That information always lives in your organization via some process. So what processes generate that data? Okay, those processes can be either effective, ineffective, manual, automatic, whatever, but you need to look at the overall process and then decide, is that the best process to produce that information, or is it something different? You can look at the systems in which that process lives. Is that part of my ERP system? Is it part of my CRM system? Is it part of a manufacturing execution system? Right? Where's that data going? Where's the system that's holding that? And that kind of gets all the way back into the infrastructure. How's my infrastructure set up to facilitate this? Am I looking at a common data environment? Is all my data shared in one central location? Or do I have little pieces of data all over the place that aren't related? Right. One of the big drivers for ERP, I think, going forward is really data analytics, AI, and modeling, so that you can ask the system questions of the business and can generate that information. To do that, you have to have all the data in a coherent fashion in a way you can get to it. So the kind of questions to ask to tease out that information really start with the questions the business is asking, and then walk it back from questions to data to how the frequency, how it needs to be displayed, to the processes that generate it, to the systems or the applications that automate that process, and then the infrastructure it runs on.
Great. Amanda, let us know if that was helpful. And then Michael asked, I understand what Peter said about ERP answering questions being a motivator for executives, but what do you do if no one on the executive team understands what ERP does? How do you quickly and efficiently educate them?
Well, I'm not sure they actually have to know what ERP does, because ERP is just 3 letters in the alphabet. I think what they have to understand is their business and what they're trying to accomplish in business and where the challenges are. What information do they need to make better decisions? I think you can let the executives work with that and don't work with a specific ERP system. The actual ERP system that gets selected and implemented is really, I think, a step down from that. Those are the people who are going to derive the benefit of the system, but they're not the operators of the system. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but.
Yeah, I hope it does. I do have something to piggyback on both of those, which I think, asking the right questions and making sure you know that you have data in disparate sources and you want to have that together is super important. I'm just going to give you, if you don't mind, I'll share my screen just for a second here. I think that value stream mapping can really help with some of this. So here's an example I did a long time ago, or I guess 5 years ago. Have a new product introduction value stream map. And I remember the president came into the room, right? We had all the stakeholders in there. We were writing up the current state. We were putting the red stickies in the colored boxes on things that were redundant or, waste of time or whatever it was. And he's like, it looks like somebody threw a bunch of paintballs at the wall and we have no idea what we're doing. And that was a visceral response that he had and was very easily able to say after that, oh my gosh, we need something better. Right. So if you can map out what you're doing today and identify all those points of waste, it might be a quick-ish, way to get your executive team to say, oh my gosh, there's got to be a better way. Right.
Yeah. And Michael, let us know if you still have a question on that one. And then Steve asked, how do you deal with situations where there are multiple ERPs, legacy systems that have been layered over one another, but they're all still in place?
Well, it's a great challenge. So you tend to have to solve the problem both globally and then one ERP at a time. So we have to understand what the overall organization's after. But if you're multiple divisions and you have multiple ERP systems, we don't necessarily want one ERP system that papers over the entire organization that burdens different departments or divisions with inefficiencies. So, again, you're asking a really subtle question, but we have to tease it out. So sometimes the best thing to do is to have different ERP systems or different instances of the same ERP system so you can optimize the processes for each business unit and then make sure that those are done in a coherent way, particularly at the chart of accounts level, so you can roll up all those costs into the master organization and have that kind of a consolidated overview of everything. But you definitely want to be able to optimize your operations, right? ERP is an operations system that ties into finance and accounting. It's not an accounting system. So you really want to make sure it drives the efficiencies in your operations all along the way, picking up the data so you can answer the questions the executives need to have answered. So, they answer the questions.
Yeah, and I'll just jump on that one too. I realized I should show you the future state, because if you have a lot of different systems and people wonder how many of these are really necessary, I think it's also nice, and I'll share my screen one more time, to look at how you could streamline something. Here's that same process I described before in its future state. And this is where you don't even say what you're going to use, but you say this is how it can be done. And after you do this, you might be able to find out that some of those layered systems can be out. They're not actually serving a good purpose, or they're very critical. So again, I'm a huge fan of mapping, so that's just my 2 cents.
Great. So no more questions in the channel right now. And Steve, feel free, if you have follow-up questions, to ping those in. But moving forward, so once we have decided, okay, we need to assess ERP systems for our organization, how long should it take to find the right system? Am I looking at a 6-month thing? Am I looking at like a 1-week sprint? What does that look like?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. I'll start on that one. I think the team is super important. And so you want to know how long it takes. I think it would depend on how dedicated your team is and if you have somebody organizing that. So let's assume that you do have a project manager and that you have a good core team who really understands your business and what you need. And they're willing and able to dedicate, I would say, the core team 3 to 5 hours a week at least, and the project manager maybe 15 to 20. In our experience, it takes about 3 months, about a quarter. So Peter, if you have anything to add.
Well, so a successful implementation starts at the selection process. So don't shortchange the selection process. Even if you think you know the application you want, the selection process is less about picking the application than it is about getting alignment on your team, making sure everybody has the same vision of what you're trying to accomplish and the commitment to do that. And the best way to do that is a very participatory selection process to look at what the marketplace can offer you and teach you about how the marketplace can solve your business problems and not just presuppose a solution. It really brings the team up along with you, which is why it takes, as Andrea said, usually somewhere around 3 months to do that.
I'm on mute asking a question. So kind of a follow-up question to that. If I am, a smaller startup looking at really our first ERP system, or say I am in a situation where, hey, we have a legacy system, 10 to 15 years, their process is built all around that. Is that 3 months still the same for either of those organizations? Or if I am more of like an older organization with more mature processes, should I expect that actually takes a bit longer?
Well, you can kind of go either way on that one. I think it has more to do with the complexity of the organization and its maturity than necessarily the size of the organization. So we've done some work with one company that had like 6 different operating units that had no relationship to each other. And they all were trying to fit into the same data environment. It became very complex because of that. And so we had to basically treat it almost like 6 separate ERP implementations to get everybody, what they needed to really optimize their business. So the answer to your question really comes down to a couple of things, right? There's always the capacity issue of, when you bring in an outside group like us or Andrea, right? We come in and we help you guys. We can't do the work for you. If we did that, then you would end up with our ERP system. There'd be no buy-in and it would typically fail, hence 75% failure rate. So you guys have to do the work. You have to go through the process and the learning to really get that alignment on your team and build a strong team for a successful implementation. So, how long does that take? Well, it varies, but I think for most what I'll say kind of the small, medium businesses, I think 3 months is a pretty fair estimate of the overall time frame.
All right. And so, again, you've provided a great segue to the next question. So we know that ERP systems are expensive. It's a big line item in people's budgets. And doing an assessment like this, we're saying, hey, it's going to take 3 months to assess it. I kind of hear dollar signs in the back of my head. What should I expect to spend money on the selection process? If so, how much?
So let's look at it in a little bigger picture. The short answer to your question is yes, you're going to spend money on the selection process. But what we really want to do is we want to get the overall end state, which is to have a successful implementation of an ERP system that answers the questions the executives are looking to have answered about the business. So that's the outcome. So what we want to do is have the lowest possible price to get the highest possible return in that. So if we do a lot of good work in the selection process and build a strong team and get a lot of our questions answered there, it makes the implementation go faster. So if we look at kind of area under the curve, it's about a wash. If you don't answer the questions, if you don't think about it in the selection process, then you're going to have to do it further downstream in the implementation process. But once you're in the implementation process, if you change your mind, now you have to go back and perhaps reselect a different ERP, and so the cost actually goes up to do it that way. So I'm a big believer in, let's put some thought process to this. Let's ask some good questions. Let's build that team and do that at the outset, and then the rest of the process goes more smoothly.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, Peter. Thank you. And I want to just, again, give a couple of anecdotal stories. So we're working with a construction company now, and they didn't do a selection. Their legacy system was closing. They had to get something new. They just took what the legacy system recommended and just said, that's going to be it for us. And we're helping them implement, but they're coming down to the wire and they realize the new system doesn't do job costing. This is a construction company. And so now they're spending money in customizations to be able to get that functionality. Whereas if they would have looked at it up front, they could have chosen a different system out of the box, would have had that. And I guarantee that it would have cost them less if they would have hired someone like Peter to help them figure that out. Then they're going to pay for this customization now. And the other thing I'd like to bring up is, I think companies, and I get it, it's a cash flow issue. Can I afford this for 3 months or whatever it's going to take? But I think you need to think about the opportunity cost as well. So if you don't do it, and maybe you don't spend money on focused support and guidance, it might take you longer to figure it out. You might choose something that doesn't work so well for you. Your team is going to be working more and therefore not able to help your customers in the way they otherwise would have. Maybe your errors and whatever are going to go on for longer. You aren't going to get new business, can't scale as fast, whatever it is. There's certainly an opportunity cost at stake that will translate to real dollars. So I would encourage companies to really consider, maybe not just what's it going to cost me to get some help with selection, but what's it going to cost me if I don't?
Right.
Yeah.
Both Andrea and I, we have lots of horror stories we can share about companies, who didn't go through an appropriate selection process, ended up with a tool that ended up costing them a lot of money downstream and wish they'd have done it differently. It happens. It actually happens a lot. Probably, I would say more so that happens than not. So I think doing an effective selection process really helps mitigate that risk.
Yeah, and I think kind of what we're getting to is just this idea that like a stitch in time saves nine. That really just there's like some value in going through the process, and it's not to be overlooked. Jeff just pinged into the channel, pay me now or pay me later. I've seen multiple companies that have chosen systems and either abandoned them or in implementation or shortly after go live, and I think that we've all seen that in our various roles.
Right, and to me, that's the most costly thing you can do is take all that time and effort, spend all that money, take all your resources and focus them on building a new ERP environment, and you get done and then you abandon it after go live. So you've incurred all the cost and you have not only no benefit, you have negative benefit. That's a horrible situation to be in.
Absolutely. And Amanda just asked a question around, is there a good way to calculate ROI on figuring out things in the selection process versus during implementation?
I am a big fan of ROI calculations with the caveat that they tend to be more tactically focused rather than strategically focused. So a good ERP system, the reason for it is both tactical and strategic. But let's kind of take that apart for a minute. So if we look on the more tactical side, it's very easy to look at headcount and processes, look at waste in your processes, is what Andy was talking to with her, your value mapping process. Look at where the waste is, the inefficiencies, and you can calculate what the gain would be, right? If I can take out maybe a couple of, man days a week out of overall processes, what's that save me? And don't keep in mind that you're already paying something for the existing system. So there is a partial offset when you don't have to do that anymore. That's part of your calculation, right? They get, the ROI calculations get pretty complex. And while I like them, I don't want to get too far off in the weeds on them. So I think a back of the envelope is pretty good with a little bit of grounding. And this is, hopefully you have a reasonably good finance team that can help you through that process, because I think it's important. That's part of how you know whether you're winning or not. Because when you select an ERP system, it should have a positive return for all the investments you're making. And this gets to what's that future state of the business? What are you trying to become? So what's my measure for success, right? as you go through the ERP process, I want to make sure that we are going to hit that successful mark. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on that because I agree. It's really hard to do a clear-cut, simple, easy ROI calculation, although I do think there is some value in the big picture style that Peter was describing. One thing I've done in the past, especially for sales, is let's say that you're on customer services taking in orders, and let's say it's very manual right now, and you want to grow and double your size. What's it going to cost you to double the number of customer service people? And then what about the pick, pack, and ship of whatever it is and production of whatever it is? I mean, you could think about those things. And then, it's not a one-for-one scale with an ERP. It doesn't mean you're never going to hire another customer service person, but you should be able to expect that some of the things they're doing would be more automated, more efficient, and quicker. That's maybe just one angle to look at an ROI, but it's similar to me to change management, right? Like, how do you say there's an ROI to change management if people are now being communicated with and they're aware of what's going on and they're on board and aligned and ready to go, versus if you didn't do any of that stuff? Well, that's just really hard to measure in dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, the next question that we have set up, and I think kind of speaks to the part of the ROI calculation, is really about the cost of an ERP. So, after we've selected it, how should I expect to spend on this new ERP system?
So as a general rule of thumb, you're going to have licensing costs or the equivalent of the software itself. Usually that's around 25% of your overall ERP budget. You'll have about another 25% in vendor implementation, probably 20% in outside implementation, and then maybe a 10% annual maintenance fee. And then don't forget, one of the other costs that typically goes uncalculated in all this is your internal cost, your internal labor cost. I mentioned earlier that you can't effectively hire outside consultants to come in and do this for you. You're going to have to do some of this work. Now, you might find it more appropriate to bring in some, augment some staff to free up your staff from doing some of the more mundane things so that they can participate in building the future. Your staff can build the future. But however you want to deal with it, there is some cost. There's cost to overtime, there's cost to, people working weekends, evenings, trying to, work double duty. Your people are already busy, so you're going to have a lot of those internal costs. And that's one of the things that usually gets overlooked. Having a good outside project manager can really help reduce some of those internal costs, both that get produced from the vendor who will try and push work back to you, but also can help you manage and anticipate where those costs are going to come and where those crunches are going to be. So I'll turn it over to Andrea because she's the PM expert.
Thanks, Peter. And, I want to iterate one thing you said before I continue on project management, which is, can you outsource some of the more mundane things your team does today to free them up for the more complex requirements for the ERP implementation? And one thing Peter's company does with managed IT, we're actually working with the company right now that the IT director is the main person internally, and he has one IT person that handles the internal company's, questions about email and servers, and God forbid when it went to COVID and everybody was, trying to get their cameras to work. Anyway, whenever this woman who works for him goes on vacation, it's his job to do that. And the whole project stops for however long that other person's on vacation. So, if you can outsource something like that, by all means do it. And back to the project management, we typically find that for most companies we work with, in the sort of 15 to maybe 300 million or so range, you don't need a full-time project manager. We typically work about 15, 20 hours a week, and that's sort of our sweet spot. And then we flex when it's necessary. So I would encourage you to look at, your outsourced PM. Do you need a full-time person? Can it be done with part-time help, which will really, give you a bit more value? And then if you're going to do it yourself, I think there's 3 things to really make sure your project manager can do. One is that they're super detail oriented and organized, right? They're capable to be a project manager. The second thing is they have time and availability in their own schedule to spend 15 or 20 hours a week on the project. And then the third thing is to make sure that they are well-rounded and objective enough about your business that they aren't going to make the ERP all about the accounting team or all about the operations team. It's really about the whole company. And I think, Peter, you might have said that before. So, and then bigger companies with maybe more than 2 or 3 sites might consider a change manager as well. The project manager is focused on execution and schedules and tasks, and the change manager is focused on adoption and readiness and awareness and training. So 2 roles to really consider.
Great. And then Jacob dropped a question in the chat. So with regards to the general cost breakdown that we laid out, would that breakdown change, and how so, when thinking about perpetual licenses on-prem systems versus SaaS ongoing licensing cost systems?
Okay, so you kind of touching on one of the common issues that we run into with the cloud and the new licensing mechanisms and models that are out there. You can either rent your application or you can own your application. And if you rent, it's typically an operating expense. And if you own it, you might capitalize it as a capital expense. So how you want to run your ROI calculation, or at least what we do, is I try and look at say a 5-year lifetime and use that as like a 5-year cost, which fairly normalizes the difference between either perpetual license or renting or on-prem or whatever. And keep in mind, if you're going to put it on-prem or in your own private cloud, you do have cost of infrastructure that you also have to calculate in there. Because if you're going to stand up your own servers at Azure, right, there's a cost to that. If you're going to do just a pure cloud-hosted environment from the application vendor, it's a different cost. You'll pay for it in rental fees that way. And if you're going to put it on-prem, you're going to have servers or whatever else you need to do on-prem. So that's how I would approach that.
Great. And then I think at this point we'll start. Oh, you had a quick follow-up, but I'll just mention to everyone, we're going to start kind of doing more of an open question and answer period at this point. So if you have some, feel free to drop them in the channel, and I'll ask Jacob's question while you guys think about that. So thank you. And a quick follow-up, are you seeing more companies moving to the SaaS model, or is it not trending in that direction?
Absolutely. I don't see any reason to own your software, although we can run the make versus buy kind of scenarios and decision process. But I think SaaS and cloud hosted, renting your applications, I think is definitely the wave of the future. So just to speak to that for a sec, if your organization is in one building, one geography, and it's all inside the 4 walls, then I can argue that having an on-prem solution could potentially be less costly. If you have any kind of geographic distribution, you have salespeople out in the field, multiple locations, anything like that, then you'll want to get your infrastructure and your systems out of your 4 walls because it's easier to communicate it to everybody. The other thing that really comes into play here is what I'll call kind of the new update cycle that's out there. It used to be that software vendors would update their products maybe annually, maybe twice a year. Some of the lamer ones once every 2 or 3 years, some never at all. But if you own your product, one of the problems is that upgrade cycle. If you rent the product or it's a SaaS product, it will get updated and always stay current in the cloud whenever the vendor decides to do that. There's good news and bad news with that. The good news is you'll always be on a current supported product. You'll always have the latest gongs, bells, whistles, etc. The bad news is sometimes you show up in the morning and it looks and works a little bit differently than it did yesterday. Welcome to life in the 21st century. It's just like Facebook or Teams or Microsoft products or Google products or anything else, right? They all change sometimes from day to day. If you've made customizations to your ERP system, and I will strongly advise you to avoid all customizations at all costs, don't do that. But if you do that, now you are locked into a forever problem that every time the vendor wants to upgrade the package, you are now responsible for all the integration testing and validation to make sure your mods will work. They won't do that for you, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. One of the worst situations we've seen is when companies end up with ERP systems they've modified so heavily, they are now trapped in that system. And pretty soon after a while, right, so we have a client right now that has an ERP system. They've so heavily customized it, it will only talk to Microsoft Excel like from about 20 years ago, one of the very early versions of Excel. It won't talk to any current version. So, I mean, the ERP system, if you customize it, can really hamstring the rest of your business. So I strongly encourage you to not go down that path. I know I answered some different questions than you asked, but hopefully that got it in there.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump on that, Peter, because back to the question on, are people going to the cloud, which Jacob, I think was your original question. And our experience is also, yes, we're not doing any on-prem right now. Everybody's going to the cloud. And I think after COVID, even if you're in the example Peter described within your own four walls, having a contingency plan for a pandemic like this is now most likely on everybody's radar, where people will be working from home. So one of the systems we're doing is moving from an on-prem system into the cloud. And the pain they were having before, when COVID hit and everybody went to work from home, is every time they tried to get into the system, they had to VPN in, then they're getting dropped, and they're super frustrated. Their IT people are spread out too. It's just painful. So I don't necessarily see a trend going back to on-prem, personally.
Yep. I agree.
And then Steve asked, with the SaaS model you described, what happens if after several years you decide to move to a new system? What are the challenges when you make that move?
So this is one of the considerations when you're doing your initial contract with your newly chosen, SaaS partner. They always make it very easy to get data into their systems. They usually make it difficult to get data out of their systems. So you want to make sure that you have some mechanism for getting the data out in a way that's actually viable. So that they should give you, the systems in a CSV format with, all the tables and columns and rows and headers and everything in it, or in some format where you actually have a chance to pull up that data and do something with it in the future as you move.
Got it. It looks like we have another question coming in the chat. But I would ask both Andrea and Peter, when you think about successful ERP implementations and really starting at that, first assessment stage, are there prerequisites that I can look at as somebody who might have been just tasked with, okay, you own the new ERP selection and implementation process, Gavin. What should I be looking at? What's like my little miniature checklist to go, okay, I kind of have my ducks in a row, or at least enough to take the next step?
Well, that's condolences on that, and congratulations on your new role. It's a double-edged sword, but I kind of go back to the beginning. So let's start out and understand what are the drivers for why we think we need a new ERP system. So as we go through that and understand what the future is going to look like, what business we're striving to become, all of a sudden it will reveal the weaknesses in the current system. Not that we don't know what those are, but it will reveal them in a different way. So now we have a way to see what we want it to look like, not just based on what we don't like about the current system. People by and large, when they think about stuff, think about it constrained by the reality they know. So if they're used to a particular ERP system and you ask them what they want different, they usually couch that in terms of, well, I want it different than this, or I want it to look like this one, but I want it to do this thing and I want it to be faster or whatever. They can't really think out into the future. This is one of the values that groups like ours or Andrea's can bring to bear, is to help people pull that out. And I think if you're going to be in that role, that becomes your role to help people think about that future they want to become. And then you can look at it starting with, I like to look at flows of information. Mm-hmm. And so there are three key flows in every organization out there, right? There's order to cash, procure to pay, and record to report. Those three major processes encompass pretty much everything else that's inside an ERP system. And so you can start at pick one, say order to cash. So how do we get orders, right? How do those come in? What do we do with them? How do we validate them? How do we price them? How do we estimate? How do we quote them? right? We can do all that stuff. How do we enter that order into the system? What happens? How do we, schedule it? Do we issue work orders? And really follow that whole process all the way through with your own team members, and it will reveal your own processes if you're documenting along the way. That gets you really far down that path. And by asking questions, it will also stimulate people's thinking. And what you're really doing is you're building a body of knowledge around your existing processes and what you want them to be, which is going to form the basis of your, what you can call a request for proposal or a request for engagement, to send out to vendors to have them teach you about how they would solve your problems.
Awesome. And so we have 10 minutes left. I'm not seeing any more questions in the channel. People feel free to drop them in, but I think I'll just kind of transition us into our key takeaways. Oh, Jacob just asked if you mind repeating those 3 processes, Peter.
Sure. There's order to cash, okay, procure to pay, and record to report.
Perfect. Thanks for grabbing those, Andrea.
All about execution and documenting things. I tell you what, I can't say how many times we've seen that people don't write down what they just decided to do as a team, and then you go have the discussion again. That's a big pet peeve.
Yep. But that assumes people actually read your notes and stuff, which some do, some don't. So.
At least I can go back and read them.
Yeah.
Okay, and then our ERP selection takeaways.
Looks like we've given Amanda writing cramp. She's got 4 pages of notes so far. Sorry about that. All right, so just some takeaways here. So number 1, ERP is an operation system for your entire company, not just accounting and finance. So it's going to change the way your people work together. It's going to change the culture of your company, or at least it has the power and potential to do that if you want to take advantage of this opportunity to shift things. Okay? The implementation matters as much or more than the ERP application. I know I'm reading these, but I think they're really important. So the implementation is where the rubber meets the road. It's what you actually do. If you don't implement well, so you can take Jeff Osorio, who's somewhere out here in listener land, he'll laugh at this one, but right, you take a good application and you implement it poorly and you get junk. You take a mediocre or adequate application and you implement it well, it can change the world for you. So the actual application, while it matters, doesn't matter as much as the implementation. If you have a poor implementation, all you're going to get is bad data faster, and that's not going to help you. So you want to consider your future business and the processes you're going to need to have in the future to run that business before you start selecting the application. Right? You have to know what you want to be when you grow up before you go out for selection. And just a quick aside on the selection process. If you just invite vendors in to demo their products, you're going to get a sales pitch from every one of them, and they're going to jump around the screens. It's going to be really flashy. You're going to have no idea what you're looking at. Have them come in and demonstrate your new processes in their system using a subset of your data in their system so your people can recognize it, can see it, and turn that process into an educational process rather than just a sales process. Okay? You want, if there are questions, holler at all those, but assemble and align your core implementation team during the selection phase. And don't forget that part of your implementation team is not only your internal people, it's your external consultants like Andrea or us. It's also the vendors that we're going to be inviting in as we move through this process. Because at the end of the selection, right, you've made your selection, that vendor, because of the way you've set up the whole process, now knows enough about your business to contribute. They're not just selling you anymore. Now they're contributing to you. Another one of the key factors in having it be success. So set all that up in the selection phase. And remember, 75% of ERP initiatives fail, and they typically fail due to a lack of team coherence and commitment, which is really all about poor leadership. So you have to lead. It doesn't mean you tell people what to do. You have to lead and create that future so that they can follow and help drive you into it.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm not going to repeat any of these, but just to underscore the overall theme, which really is getting your team aligned and working on this together. And we've seen situations when we're doing right now with a great selection, the core team all came together, the president of the company is super involved and an advocate, and they have a change manager and a project manager. And it's not going to be easy, right? It's not going to not take time, but it's going so much more smoothly than a few others that were doing that didn't have that really strong alignment at the outset. It's just so important, and you're going to spend a lot of money on this thing. You might as well do it right.
Absolutely.
And one more question came in the chat, and then we'll kind of move on to our next slide. Jacob said, our company is 90 years old, and we run a 30-year-old on-prem green screen system. The demos we've received are showing us how they would work through our current processes, which are hard to change. If we implement now a new system with our current processes, would you say it will be much harder to change the processes at a later date? Or is it reasonable to say we may be able to simplify our processes later?
So I'll answer the question by kind of in a roundabout way. So you have an opportunity now to invent the company you want to be unencumbered from the ERP system you had, right? If you're a 90-year-old company with a 30-year-old ERP, that ERP was built for a different company than you are today. In today's world, not only is IT very dynamic, but your customers are dynamic, your employees are dynamic, the products you're making are dynamic. Everything's changing all the time. So a 30-year-old ERP system that hasn't changed is a boat anchor to your company. Now, I don't know exactly because I haven't talked to you in any detail about that, but it's just, it's very likely it's a problem. So I think you have an opportunity to reinvent some processes for the sake of the business you are today and want to become in the future. I would suggest we make that investment now. Otherwise, what will happen, we'll take the new ERP system, we'll implement it to replace the old ERP system, doing what the old ERP system did. So all we've really accomplished at the end of that process, outside of some pretty screens, is we've increased the cost to the organization by the cost of the implementation process, but we haven't moved the organization forward. Then you're going to do another implementation of yet another iteration of that ERP, which is, don't get me wrong, it's going to be like a whole new implementation to change the processes. Because sometimes you can't just change one process, you have to change a whole bunch of processes. Because all these processes are systems of systems. You can't always just change one thing at a time. So I hope that was a good answer to your question.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback and say, one of the things that you're going to do if you're resistant to changing process, because process change is always the hard part, but it's also where all the value sits. And so what you're going to do if you delay that is you're really flattening your ROI curve and sending it way down the line. And you don't want to do that. Your executives don't want to do that. Lean into the hard part now because you're going to get the fruits from it a lot quicker. Okay, so moving forward to the contact us slide.
All right, and just so y'all know, if you have questions, you want to reach out to us directly, Andrea's contact information is up there, as is mine. Please feel free to do so.
Absolutely. We'd love to hear from you. Or any of your friends or colleagues, family members, children, dogs. No, I'm just kidding.
But if the dog is doing an ERP selection, we will help.
Probably need some help.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, awesome. If there are no other questions, I just really want to thank everyone for taking an hour out of their Wednesday and joining us. hopefully this was a great use of your time. And yeah, feel free to reach out to any of us in the future.
Thank you guys so much.
You bet.
Best of luck.
Thanks.
All righty. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.